The Washington Capitals are looking to bounce back and get back to the playoffs in 2023-2024. Dan Holmi of Locked On Caps is here to talk about that, the latest on Evgeny Kuznetsov, and all things Capitals next on the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. And you can also find us on the SXM app on SiriusXM. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. The Washington Capitals in the news again, and whenever that happens, we bring in Dan Holmi of Locked On Capitals. Dan, great to have you here. And let's start off with some relatively new news. Talk to me about what's going on with Evgeny Kuznetsov.
So this just broke today that there's a podcast called Slippery Ice, and Evgeny Kuznetsov was on there, and he finally said, yes, I did say that I wanted out of DC. He actually had conversations with GM Brian McClellan a couple times saying that he wanted out. Why? Because he did not agree with Peter Laviolette's coaching style. Peter Laviolette was more of a dump and chase and then screen the goalie. He thought that the centers were underutilized, that, there was the Capitals had a myriad of injuries. And I think that was an easy excuse why they didn't play well. But he said that they had the manpower on the team to get it done. It's just that Peter Laviolette was not utilizing the players correctly. He talked about that for a lot of players that, getting a big paycheck is good enough for them, but not for him. He likes the big paycheck, but he wasn't happy. And that's why he was underperforming. And if you take a look at Kuznetsov, there is a lot of people throwing shade in his direction, but he was a first-round pick. And for the longest time on the Capitals, they always said, we need this really solid second line center. Back then, Backstrom was the top line center. And then came along Kuznetsov, this great guy from over in Russia that no one could say his name, this Kuznetsov guy. Well, he finally came over here and killed it for a couple years. And, he's a bit of a hot and cold player. He is a bit of a quirky guy. He's one of the guys that said, I could be the best player in the NHL if I wanted to be. I just don't want to put in the work. But I do believe that this is going to be the year for Evgeny Kuznetsov. I think he is engaged with Coach Spencer Carbery, and there is a lot of positivity surrounding Carbery, and most notably with Kuznetsov. I think that their philosophy is more on the same page, and now more I'm seeing the reason I believe that they did not trade Kuzi out of Washington is because I think that GM Brian McClellan knew that there was a disconnect between Kuzi and Peter Laviolette, and probably a lot of the other players as well. I think that, Peter Laviolette saw the writing on the walls, and he's like, I know what's going on here, and I want out of town. So good signs for Kuzi, good sign for the Capitals. I think that positivity and enthusiasm abounds.
Do you think, who are some of the other players who stayed healthy last year? Who do you think were negatively impacted by what Kuznetsov was describing?
He was talking about the center position in general. He thought that the centers were not properly utilized. He talked about Strome. He talked about Eller and Dowd, and that it's a veteran-laden team. And I know that a lot of the key veterans missed a lion's share of the season. I'm talking Wilson, Backstrom, Carlson. But I do think that there was the possibility that towards the end of the season that they could have made a push and made a wild card spot. They started on fire and they played so well in the month of December, and then the wheels fell off. Backstrom and Wilson came back and they actually played worse, if you can believe that. So I just think it was time, and I do think that the Capitals did have the manpower. If it wasn't on the big team, it would have been down in Hershey, as we see that the Hershey Bears won the Calder Cup. So evidently they're, capable of, handling themselves on a big stage. It's just more and more you're starting to hear this slowly trickle in from players, not so pointed as Evgeny Kuznetsov, but saying that there was a bit of a disconnect between Lavi and the rest of the other team. They weren't into his brand of hockey.
So now, when we've talked in the past, you've mentioned the promise that management made to Alexander Ovechkin, that as long as he was with the team, they were going to be all in to try to win another cup for him and be competitive, etc. Uh, Based on the new coaching situation and the new attitude here, do you think they can keep that promise this season?
I do. And, I'm totally drinking the Capitals Kool-Aid here, and I'm drunk on it. I mean, just as I watch camp here, it's nothing but positive interviews, something that I haven't seen, even before I hosted it for Locked On. I've covered this team or watched this team for many years. And, usually it's like, oh, we're doing the training camp and we got to do the skate test. But no, all the interviews with all the players, I'm talking Tom Wilson and Connor McMichael and Alex Ovechkin, everyone is super pumped to have Spencer Carbery here. He's young, relatively speaking, and I think that, he can relate more to the Capitals based on familiarity. He coached the Stingrays and the Hershey Bears, so he has familiarity even with a lot of the guys in the AHL. And I think that there is just a rapport with him and the other players and even the assistants. I just think that this is the makings of a perfect storm, if you will, for the Capitals that is trying to squeeze the most that they possibly can out of this aging roster, this rock the red era. I do think they can do it. I do think they can make it to the playoffs this year. I'm not going to go ahead and etch their name in the side of the Stanley Cup yet, but I do think they will make it to the playoffs.
One wild card, obviously, the health and performance of Max Pacioretty. Any updates on his situation, when they expect him back, and what he may add to the lineup?
So Brian McClellan was asked that, and he says, I don't have any word. He was receiving treatment when he was asked about it when camp opened up. He said he should have more details. But Max did come out and say that he's not going to be ready for game one of the regular season. And I've heard some things about November or potentially December. The tough thing about it is that he has suffered Achilles issues the last two seasons. And, we can see how that kind of plays out. If you don't know what I'm talking about, take a look at Rodgers for the Jets, for example, that it can be a bit difficult. And the reason that the Capitals were able to get Max in the first place was because he was a bit dinged up. I don't think the Capitals could have afforded him. A guy that has scored 30 goals 6 times in his career. No way. But I do think that when he comes, even if they can get a fraction of that, I mean, if he can get 30 goals, I mean, hey, I'm singing his praises. But even if he could score, let's say 20 goals, I definitely think that would help what ails the Capitals, as it was Alex Ovechkin who carried the bulk of the mail last year.
Yeah, 24th in goals, if I'm not mistaken, in the NHL. Very surprising for the Caps. Any prospects that we need to keep an eye on? Any young players who you expect to be fighting for a roster spot or even impacting this team this year?
Well, if you're an everydayer of Locked On Capitals, I will say that I do believe that this is going to be the year for Ivan Miroshnichenko. He was the player that had that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and Ross Mahoney, who was in charge, the assistant GM, said that, when he met Ivan, he was so skinny that the jeans were just hanging off his hips. But he put in the hard work in the offseason. He bulked up. He put on weight. He was able to terminate his contract with the KHL, and he was skating with Alex Ovechkin. Quite a thing there. I've often dubbed him as Alex Ovechkin 2.0. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but he looks pretty good setting up one-timers from Ovi's office. So I would keep an eye out for Ivan Miroshnichenko. I do think he'll make the Caps at some point. Another player that we've heard about for quite some time and has had a cup of coffee with the Capitals is Connor McMichael. I do believe that this is going to be his year as well. As he talked about in his interviews there, he said, obviously I can handle myself on the big stage. As the Hershey Bears won the Calder Cup. And, the one thing I'm going to say about a lot of these young players is they are far more mature for their age than I was at their age. They're playing on the big team. And then they get sent down to the AHL. And for a lot of guys, you would sulk and you would moan. Not these guys. They just put in their effort. They didn't complain about it. And look at the proofs in the pudding there, as the Hershey Bears won a Calder Cup. And that's evident throughout a lot of the young players. Hendrix Lapierre and Ivan Miroshnichenko. There's no sulking that they're playing at a lower level. But in any event, I would say Connor McMichael and Ivan Miroshnichenko and perhaps Vincent Iorio on the blue line. It's a bit of a difficult position on the blue line, as it is a bit packed. I would pencil him as potentially a seventh defenseman. Of course, Alex Alexiev also fits in there. So I do think that it is going to be a battle. And I think that, it's not necessarily going to be set in stone. I'm going to say go ahead and write it in pencil with maybe a big eraser on there, because I think that things are going to be changing throughout the season. But it is exciting to finally have a coach that is going to be willing to work with the young players. There was always that reluctance with Peter Laviolette and previous coaches. So I'm pretty excited about this season.
All right, change in tone. Let's see if there's a change in results. Dan, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
All right, you can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. Of course, we're available wherever you can find your podcasts and on YouTube, including the SiriusXM app. So check it out.
All right, Dan, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. That's why Jase Medical offers the Jase Case. The Jase Case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. It gives you a peace of mind so that you are not just hoping that you have access to medication in an emergency. Jase Medical makes sure you have the medication in hand. Jase Medical is simple. They handle everything from the online evaluation to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation and care. So don't get caught unprepared. Get $20 off on these life-saving antibiotics today from Jase Medical by using my code LOCKEDON at checkout on jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. Check it out.